Day 50. The math was simple. Billions reduced to thousands. The world didn't end. It was just emptied. The event was a whisper, a global electronic pulse that fried every circuit. The war, which came next, was a 112-minute scream. The bombs and counter-bombs. By day 50, the living had divided. There were no more nations, no more laws. There were only the factions. First, there were the hiders. He-hiders believed they could wait it out. They were wrong. The old world had built strong tombs, but it had not built new futures. Then, there were the hunters. They saw the new world not as a tragedy, but as a promotion. They had been nothing before. Now, they were kings. Third, there were the scavengers. They were the rats of the new world, living in the cracks. They knew the new rules. Sound is death. The floor is for the dead. And Best Buy, dates are a lie. And finally, there were the ghosts. Sickness was the true ruler of Day 50. The falling sickness, the survivors called it. The price for being too close, but not close enough. The children of Day 50 were different. They did not cry. They did not laugh. They just watched. But in some, the old world's instinct to rebuild was too strong to die. When the final sirens faded, the world entered a silence deeper than anything humanity had ever known. It was not the silence of peace, nor the silence of death, but the silence of absence. For the first time since civilization began, the planet itself seemed to stop breathing. The first detonations came without warning. Satellite communications collapsed within seconds. Moscow, Washington, Beijing, London, Berlin, Islamabad, Tokyo. Each became coordinates in a new equation of extinction. Within 1 hour, the human race had undone a century of progress. Those who survived the first week remember the sky before they remember the bombs. In New York, ash fell like snow across Manhattan, turning the Hudson into a river of gray light. In Moscow, people wandered through burning streets, carrying photographs instead of food. In Beijing, 1 million cell phones glowed in the dark before their batteries died forever. And in Karachi, families huddled on rooftops, watching a horizon they could no longer trust. The noise ended quickly. The air changed color. Electricity vanished from half the planet in a single night. The global grid, once a network of human ambition, had become a map of dead light. In Tokyo, the train stopped mid-tunnel. Hundreds of thousands of people sat in darkness, waiting for an announcement that never came. In London, the Thames overflowed as emergency pumps failed, washing the embers of Parliament into the river. In Chicago, sirens wailed until their batteries drained, leaving the city lit only by burning fuel depots. Then, everywhere, came the quiet. Birds disappeared first. Dogs barked through the ruins until their voices broke. Children no longer cried. They simply stared at the sky. The war had lasted 22 days. The consequences would last forever. The United Nations no longer existed. Governments fractured into pockets of command that never heard from each other again. The term nation itself began to dissolve. Borders were no longer drawn on maps, but on survival. Who still had water? Who still had fire? In France, survivors climbed the ruins of Marseille, searching for ships that would never return. In Germany, the Black Forest glowed faintly from radiation dust settling in the trees. In Ukraine, the soil itself became a weapon, poisoned by the wind. People began to speak in whispers, as if the sky could still hear them. Scientists estimated that 1/3 of the world's population had vanished in the first month. Another third would die before the year was over, not from bombs, but from what followed. Hunger, infection, exposure, silence. Those who lived wrote nothing. History ended when the power did. Still, among the ruins, there were voices. Small, fragile, human. A doctor in St. Petersburg keeping a record of patients on torn pages of a medical textbook. A farmer in rural Japan who buried his family beneath the cherry trees before winter came. A child in Cairo who found a working radio and spoke to no one every night for years. The world did not rebuild. It remembered. The second month after the war was not marked by time, only by temperature. The sunlight dimmed, filtered through a layer of radioactive dust that encircled the globe. Scientists would later call it the nuclear veil, but to those who lived beneath it, it was simply the cold. In Northern Europe, temperatures dropped 20 degrees below average. Snow fell in places that had not seen winter in decades. In cities like Warsaw, Amsterdam, and Prague, survivors broke apart furniture for firewood and cooked what remained of stored grains. The smell of burning paint, plastic, and hunger filled the air. Across the Atlantic, America was unrecognizable. The eastern seaboard, once home to 100 million, was a graveyard of submerged suburbs and silent highways. Washington, D.C. was gone. Only fragments of the Lincoln Memorial stood above water, cracked and blackened. In Chicago, the remnants of the Midwest government broadcast one message on repeat. To those who can hear this transmission, do not come here. There is nothing left. Few heard it, fewer believed it. In the deserts of Nevada, a group of Air Force survivors lived in an abandoned bunker. They rationed fuel, mapped radiation zones, and kept a list of names they could no longer confirm. Their commander, a woman named Colonel Harris, wrote in her final log, "We still operate by the manual, even though there's no command left to receive the reports." Further east, in the ruins of New York, small bands of survivors moved through the skeleton of the city. They marked safe zones with white paint. a sign that the air there could still be breathed without masks. The subways became their shelters, and among the tunnels, they learned to tell time by the rhythm of dripping water. In Russia, the winter arrived early. Moscow was uninhabitable. Its population fled south toward the Caucasus. Entire convoys froze on the highways, their headlights buried in snow, engines dead. Villages in Georgia and Armenia became overcrowded with refugees. Food riots erupted not from anger, but from the simple instinct to eat. In China, the government's remnants relocated to underground command centers beneath Chongqing and Chengdu. They maintained contact with a few surviving satellite links, attempting to monitor radiation belts and shifting weather patterns, but by the 5th month, those signals too went silent. Pakistan suffered not from the bombs themselves, but from the sky that followed. The Indus Valley turned gray. Crops failed as acid rain poisoned the fields. In Lahore and Multan, thousands moved toward the mountains, believing altitude meant safety. It did not. The clouds followed. India's northern plains became wastelands of wind-blown dust. The Ganges ran shallow and black. Refugees poured into the south, into Kerala and Tamil Nadu, forming makeshift communities on the coasts, until the monsoon came and took them too. In Japan, the survivors of Tokyo moved toward the rural north. Fishermen along the coast found their nets full of ash instead of fish. They built floating villages from plastic drums and driftwood, setting sail into the Pacific in search of currents that still carried life. Few ever returned. Everywhere, the same image repeated. The last fires of civilization flickering beneath an unending dusk. And yet, through the stillness, humanity tried to speak again. In Berlin, a former journalist named Otto Lang began keeping voice records on an old cassette recorder, speaking each day to no one. He said, "If language is memory, then maybe by speaking, we can keep something alive." In a ruined library in Istanbul, a young girl named Layla used candlelight to copy children's books by hand. She wrote the alphabet on the walls, so she would not forget the shapes of letters. In Sao Paulo, survivors gathered in subway tunnels to tell stories, not of what happened, but of what used to be. And in Alaska, a group of scientists discovered that the northern lights had changed color. They wrote, "The sky burns red now, not with beauty, but with warning." The nuclear veil thickened. Photosynthesis slowed. The global harvest, what was left of it, collapsed. No one spoke of governments anymore. There were only enclaves, shelters, fragments. Humanity had entered its smallest form. By the end of the first year, there were no more calendars. Days were counted in breaths. And still, among the ash, voices whispered, "We are still here. We remember the world." The memory was all that remained, and it was enough to keep a few alive. By the start of the second year, maps no longer mattered. The earth itself had been redrawn, not by politics, but by survival. Continents were still there, but the meaning of a country had dissolved into dust. The flags that once defined nations were now used as blankets, bandages, or fuel for fire. Human civilization had become a patchwork of scattered enclaves, tiny islands of warmth in an ocean of frozen ash. In what was once the United States, the survivors divided themselves by rivers and by fire. The Mississippi became a new frontier. West of it, nomadic groups lived off scavenged farmland. East of it, silence and sickness ruled. The old cities, Atlanta, Detroit, Boston, existed only as ruins inhabited by shadows. A voice recording found years later from a survivor in Kansas said, "We used to call ourselves Americans. Now, we just call ourselves alive." Across the Atlantic, Europe was breaking apart in its own silence. The nuclear winter stretched across the continent like a sheet of glass. Entire regions vanished beneath snow that glowed faintly at night. In the Alps, communities sheltered in old military bunkers built during the Cold War. The same bunkers once meant to prevent this very war. Among them were Germans, Italians, Swiss, Poles, no longer separated by borders but by luck. They learned to trade warmth for food, medicine for silence, loyalty for a chance to see another sunrise. In Eastern Europe, the land itself fought back. Fields in Ukraine shimmered with strange frost, the radiation twisting the very color of grass. Farmers who stayed behind called it the Shining Death. In one diary found near Lviv, a man wrote, "The soil remembers the bombs. Every seed that grows here carries their echo." Russia's vastness became both its salvation and its curse. The people scattered deep into Siberia, living near frozen rivers and abandoned gas pipelines. They burned old oil drums for heat, not fuel. And in a small settlement near Novosibirsk, they rebuilt something like a school, teaching children how to hunt, how to repair solar panels, and how to forget the names of cities. Further east, China fractured into regions of memory. The northern provinces were gone, turned to glass by hydrogen fire. The south became a mosaic of communes, survivors gathering in the ruins of schools and temples. One group in Yunnan called themselves the Keepers. They believed their purpose was to preserve language, to memorize the old words before they vanished. They held gatherings at dusk, repeating the names of the lost. Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Taipei. Each name was a prayer, each echo a resistance to oblivion. In Pakistan and India, a strange kind of truce emerged, not of politics, but of exhaustion. The line of control, once a border of war, had turned into a valley of silence. Survivors from both sides met in mountain passes to trade salt, medicine, and stories. There were no armies left to stop them. In one cave near Skardu, a man carved these words into the stone. "When the world ended, we stopped being enemies. The cold made us brothers." In Africa, the consequences took longer to arrive, but they came. Without global trade, medicine vanished. Without satellites, weather became unpredictable. Famine struck the Sahel first, then spread south toward the Congo, and east toward Ethiopia. And yet, even there, life found a way to endure. Tribal networks reformed, ancient routes reopened, people began to move again, not as refugees, but as wanderers returning to old instincts. South America became a continent of isolation. Nuclear clouds drifted across the southern hemisphere, dimming the skies over Chile and Argentina. In the Andes, survivors built wind-powered settlements, using melted glacier water to grow potatoes and beans. They spoke of the world as something that used to be, not as something to return to. Australia became a story told by sailors who never reached it. They said the coasts were empty, the air unbreathable, the desert silent. No one ever confirmed it. The oceans, too, had changed. Marine life died by the millions. The great currents slowed, the seas turned darker, thicker. The beaches of Greece, Morocco, and California were lined with what looked like black sand, the ash of a world that once burned with light. Yet, in all that ruin, whispers of order began to return. Not governments, but communities. Not laws, but agreements. In Norway, survivors established the Northern Accord, a loose network of Arctic outposts that traded fish, batteries, and stories. They used handwritten maps and radio beacons to keep contact across the frozen seas. Their motto was simple: one signal means hope. In South Africa, remnants of scientists at the University of Cape Town began archiving what they could: seeds, books, recordings, maps. They called it the Ark. Their message, transmitted once every month, was short. We do not know who will hear this, but if you do, remember, the world is still here. Do not forget her name. By the third year, the earth was quieter, smaller, older. Humanity had been humbled into fragments. And yet, somehow, those fragments glowed faintly in the dark. In every region, one thing united them all: the memory of what they'd lost. Electricity, music, color, connection, but above all, trust. No one trusted the sky anymore. Even when the clouds cleared, people walked with their heads down, afraid of what might return from above. The war had ended, but the fear had learned to live on. And still, from the ashes of 9 billion ghosts, a new kind of humanity began to emerge. K-Bai. The 5th year after the Great Silence, the skies had begun to clear. Not blue, not bright, but less heavy. The dust that once strangled the sun was thinning, revealing the faint memory of daylight. The earth had stopped burning, but it had not yet begun to heal. And from the scattered edges of what was left, humanity started to speak again. It began with radio. In the mountains of northern Italy, a group of survivors found an abandoned broadcast tower. They restored its power with salvaged car batteries and wind turbines, and one cold morning, a signal cut through the static for the first time in years. A woman's voice, cracked but steady, spoke in Italian and English. This is Station Vita. We are live. If you can hear this, respond. No one did, not at first. But 3 days later, A faint voice replied from somewhere across the sea. A fisherman off the coast of Tunisia had built a hand-cranked transmitter from parts of an old ship radio. His reply was only 2 words: "We hear." The world had changed so completely that those words, "We hear," were enough to make people weep. In what remained of Canada, an engineer named Elias McKenna recorded daily transmissions to whoever was listening. He spoke not of hope, but of instructions: how to filter contaminated water, how to read a Geiger counter, how to recognize the difference between ash and snow. His monotone voice carried across the dead airwaves, and slowly a network began to form. A quiet web of voices scattered across continents, learning once again to speak as one species. They called it the chain. Not a government, not a command, just a promise that if one voice went silent, another would keep speaking. In Pakistan, a small group of students and teachers at the University of Peshawar reactivated an old shortwave transmitter that had once been part of a physics lab. They broadcast weather readings, crop reports, and stories, myths and memories that people used to tell before the war. Their signal reached as far as Iran, sometimes even the ruins of Istanbul. They ended every transmission with the same phrase: "To live is to remember." In Poland, former miners from Katowice converted a coal shaft into a power generator, sending small bursts of energy to light the streets around their town. They called their home the Lantern. When one of their scouts found a working radio from before the war, they tuned in every night, hoping to hear the chain. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they only heard silence. But even that was better than the fear of forgetting the world's voice. In what was left of Japan, survivors built a new settlement along the northern coast. They named it Shin Hikari, New Light. Children born after the war had never seen a city, never heard an airplane, never touched a touchscreen. They grew up believing stories of the old world were legends. Their parents rarely corrected them. In Germany, a small community near the ruins of Munich held an annual ceremony. Each year, on the anniversary of the first detonations, they read aloud the names of cities that no longer existed: Kiev, Tehran, Seoul, Riyadh, Tel Aviv, Washington, Moscow. When they finished, they stood in silence, facing the direction where the sun should rise, though the sun, even now, rarely showed its face. A few remnants of the old scientific world survived too. In Antarctica, the last functioning research base, once international, now simply human, continued to gather climate data. Their final transmission to the chain read, "The ozone is rebuilding. The planet breathes again, slowly, painfully, but it breathes." After that, their signal went dark. No one knows if they froze or simply stopped speaking. In South America, farmers began to reclaim the land. The nuclear veil had spared some regions of the Andes, and from these fertile pockets grew the first signs of recovery. Communities began trading again: potatoes, salt, metal scraps. One farmer recorded a message that would later be found in a damaged recorder. We don't rebuild cities anymore. We plant memories in soil and hope they grow. By the 7th year, the population of the planet had stabilized, a fragile, wounded kind of stability. From 9 billion to barely 100 million. Every survivor carried within them the history of thousands. In Kenya, an old poet began collecting voices from travelers, survivors who had walked from Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. He wrote their stories in a book called The Atlas of the Lost. He ended it with one line: "We are the children of silence, learning again to speak." For the first time since the war, music returned. It came not from instruments, but from breath. People sang again, soft, low, ancient songs. Their ancestors once sang during famines, storms, migrations. The kind of songs made not for performance, but for survival. And in those songs, something stirred, a flicker of the human soul that even radiation could not erase. By then, the chain had grown to dozens of small signals scattered across the world. Each transmission different, in language, tone, purpose, but all united by one echo: you are not alone. Even in places where power was scarce and death was near, that message, repeated in dozens of tongues, became the pulse of a reborn species. Some began to dream again, not of rebuilding what was lost, but of understanding why it was destroyed. And for the first time, people dared to ask a question that had long been buried under fear. Could humanity learn from its own ashes? Cautious, fragile, but breathing again. 10 years after the last detonation, the planet had grown quiet enough to hear itself again. The nuclear storms had eased. The air, once metallic and heavy, now carried the faint scent of soil and rain. The earth, wounded but not broken, had begun to breathe once more. Humanity, scattered and thinned to its barest form, started to move again, not in armies, not in migrations, but in slow, deliberate footsteps, the kind that came from learning to trust the ground beneath one's feet. In the ruins of old cities, plants returned first. Green vines climbed the sides of blackened skyscrapers. Moss crept over the bones of abandoned cars. Nature had not forgiven humankind, but it had begun to forget. In what was once the United States, the survivors of the Midwest formed a loose federation of townships. They called it the Plains Union. They had no presidents, no politicians, only elected caretakers who swore an oath to never raise a weapon again. Their first law was simple. If we must fight, we fight the hunger, not each other. In Northern Europe, the Northern Accord, once a fragile network of Arctic outposts, expanded southward, helping scattered settlements connect by signal and trade. They used solar arrays salvaged from frozen cities, harnessing the first clean energy seen in decades. Their motto changed from "one signal means hope" to "one light means life." In Japan, Shin Hikari flourished. Children who had never seen the old world began to build a new one, smaller, quieter, but somehow wiser. They used broken satellite dishes, as gardens, shipwrecks as homes, and told stories of the earth that came before, not as myth, but as warning. They grew up learning not how to conquer the planet, but how to live with it. In Russia, a small group of engineers discovered a way to reactivate fragments of the global satellite network. It was crude, unstable, and limited. But for the first time since the war, images of the Earth could be seen from above. What they saw was both terrifying and beautiful. The scars of war, craters, burns, irradiated plains, stretched across continents. But between them were rivers running clear again, forests slowly reclaiming the empty lands, oceans shimmering with life that had somehow survived the darkness. The images spread through the chain, carried across frequencies and battery-powered receivers. People wept, not from sadness, but from recognition. They had lived long enough to see the world begin again. In Africa, the Ark, the archive built in Cape Town, became humanity's greatest treasure. It housed seeds, recordings, texts, and voices from the old world, preserved beneath layers of stone and steel. Every month, new travelers arrived, carrying pieces of memory, songs from the Andes, folktales from Japan, scientific notes from Europe, poetry from forgotten languages. The Ark's curator, an elderly woman named Nia, recorded one final entry before her death. We were not chosen to survive. We simply did. Now our task is to deserve that survival. By the 15th year, the human population began to grow again. Children born after the war spoke a language mixed from dozens of others, the last echo of a globalized world, transformed into something entirely new. They had no memory of nuclear fire, no concept of nations, no names for their ancestors' arrogance. They learned instead about balance, about caution, about the thin line between creation and destruction. But among the elders, those who still remembered the blue glow of old screens and the hum of machines, there was guilt, a quiet, constant ache for what was lost. Some spent their remaining years documenting what had happened, not as historians, but as confessors. They told their stories to children sitting around dim lanterns, beginning every tale the same way. Before the silence, we thought we were gods. Those children would listen, wide-eyed, and ask, "What is a god?" And the elders would not know how to answer. In time, the chain, the network of survivors' radios, became something else. It was no longer just a lifeline. It was an archive of humanity's rebirth. Thousands of voices across continents began to speak not of loss, but of what they had learned. A transmission from Norway said, "We are smaller now, but we see farther." Another from Chile, "We grow crops where the bombs fell. The earth forgives us slowly." And one from India, "We no longer dream of power. We dream of balance." It became tradition that every settlement, every surviving community, would send one message per year, a single phrase spoken in their own language, representing what they had rebuilt. The recordings, collected by the chain, were played once annually, the Day of Memory. From the Arctic to the Andes, from Karachi to Kyoto, voices merged into one whispering tide. We are here. We remember. We begin again. By the 20th year, the world had changed beyond recognition. Smaller, humbler, but alive. The great cities remained silent monuments, swallowed by green. Humanity no longer ruled the earth. It merely lived alongside it. No one called it a new civilization. They called it the continuance. The documentary closes on the voice of one last narrator, an old man from what used to be France, speaking into a cracked microphone powered by wind. If someone finds this recording, know that we did not rebuild what was lost. We learned to live without it. We once believed the end of the world would come with fire and war. But the truth is simpler. The end of the world was not the bombs. It was the moment we forgot how fragile we were. The earth does not remember the war, only we do, and perhaps that is enough.